The white lace of my sleeve brushed against the heavy vellum of a termination letter, a cruel contrast that tasted like copper and betrayal. As the orchestra began the processional, I realized my boss's son hadn't just handed me an envelope. He'd ignited a fuse leading straight to a $28 million explosion. The air in the botanical garden was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the unspoken tension of a corporate gala masquerading as a wedding. I stood at the altar, my veil caught in a gentle breeze that felt more like a warning than a caress. My husband-to-be, Julian, looked at me with eyes that promised a lifetime. But behind him, leaning against a marble pillar with a smirk that cost more than my dress, was Julian's brother, Caleb. Caleb wasn't just the best man, he was the prince of nepotism, the son of our CEO, and the man who viewed the company's infrastructure as his personal playground. As the music swelled, Caleb didn't reach for the rings. Instead, he reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. "Consider it my wedding gift," he whispered, his voice slicing through the violin's melody. He slid the paper into my hand, his fingers cold. "The board decided we don't need conflicting interests in the senior executive wing. Since you're officially family now, you're officially a liability. Happy wedding day, Elena. You're fired." The ink on the letter felt like it was still wet, bleeding into my palm. Termination effective immediately. Reason: restructuring. It was a surgical strike, timed to maximize the blood loss. I looked at Julian, whose face went pale, but his silence told me everything. He knew. The family had decided to prune the vine, and I was the first leaf to fall. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, icy clarity settle over my skin, smoother than the silk of my gown. I calmly folded the envelope, tucked it into the bouquet of lilies, and turned back to the guests. I had spent 6 years building their empire, securing their offshore accounts, and smoothing over the jagged edges of Caleb's incompetence. If they wanted me gone, they had to understand the weight of what I took with me. The ceremony continued, a hollow play act of I do's, while my professional life lay in ashes at my feet. Every time Caleb caught my eye, he winked, a shark watching a shipwreck. He thought he had cleared the board. He thought he had won the game by kicking the queen off the table. What he forgot was that the queen was the only one who knew where the gold was buried. As we walked down the aisle as Mr. and Mrs., the guests cheered, oblivious to the $28 million ghost sitting in my lace pocket. 2 hours later, while the champagne was being poured and the first dance was being announced, the first tremor hit the Richter scale of the company's headquarters. In the bridal suite, my phone buzzed. Then it roared. Missed calls from the CEO, missed calls from the CFO. A frantic text from the head of operations. The Vanguard Group just pulled the $28 million contract. They said the human guarantee is gone. Elena, where are you? I watched the screen glow in the darkened room, a beacon of a dying empire. I didn't pick up. I sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy embroidery of my dress weighing me down, and thought about the irony of it all. They wanted to protect the family from conflicts, yet they had just orphaned their largest revenue stream. The silence in the room was luxurious. Outside, I could hear the muffled laughter of the guests and the clinking of crystal, the sounds of a party that was about to run out of light. I looked at the termination letter one last time. It wasn't a pink slip. It was a release form. Caleb thought he had handed me a tragedy. He hadn't realized he'd just handed me the keys to his father's vault, and I had already changed the locks. The first guest screamed when the news hit the stock ticker, and I knew the feast was finally over. The reception hall was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance, soaring glass ceilings reflecting 1,000 flickering candles, making the room look like it was trapped inside a diamond. But as I walked back into the crowd, the sparkle felt jagged. I could see Caleb at the bar, tossing back a glass of vintage scotch, his posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he'd just performed a flawless execution. He didn't realize he'd only managed to cut the brake lines on a car he was currently driving. I moved through the guests with the grace of a ghost, every congratulations felt like a paper cut. Julian tried to catch my hand, his expression a cocktail of guilt and forced celebration. Elena, let's just get through the night, he whispered, his voice trembling. We'll talk to my father tomorrow. We can fix this. Fix it? I smiled, and for the first time, the irony wasn't bitter. It was liberating. Julian, you don't fix a wedding gift. You accept it. I looked toward the head table where the CEO, Arthur, sat like a king on a throne of dividends. His phone was on the table, face up. I knew exactly when the pulse hit. I saw the screen ignite, then again. Then a vibration so sustained, the silver cake knife next to it began to chatter against the wood. Arthur frowned, picking up the device. I watched his face transition from annoyance to confusion, and finally, to a gray, ashen mask of pure terror. He looked at Caleb, then his eyes scanned the room until they locked onto mine. I raised my champagne glass in a silent, shimmering toast. The $28 million Vanguard contract wasn't tied to the company's name. It was tied to a key person clause I had personally negotiated 3 years ago. The clause stated that if my oversight of the account was terminated for any reason other than voluntary resignation, the contract was null and void. Caleb, in his rush to flex his inherited power, hadn't bothered to read the fine print in my personnel file. He had fired the only person legally allowed to hold the money in place. Elena, Arthur's voice boomed across the dance floor, cutting through the jazz band's rendition of Fly Me to the Moon. The music faltered. Guests turned, their forks hovering over lobster thermidor. He marched toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking like a countdown. Caleb followed, looking confused, his smugness finally beginning to fray at the edges. Elena, why is Marcus from Vanguard emailing me about a breach of contract? Arthur hissed, reaching us. He was sweating, a rare sight for a man who usually bled ice water. He says the human guarantee has been liquidated. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Arthur, I said, my voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. I'm just enjoying my wedding. Ask Caleb. He's the one who handled the restructuring. Arthur turned to his son, his eyes narrowing into slits. Caleb stammered, Dad, She's family now. We had to protect the equity. I gave her the letter to keep things clean. It's just a formality. A formality, Arthur roared, forgetting the 100 pairs of socialite eyes watching us. You just triggered a kill switch on 30% of our annual revenue. He turned back to me, his hands shaking as he tried to dial a number. Answer your work phone, Elena. We need to jump on a call with Marcus right now. We can tell him it was a clerical error. I felt the weight of my phone in my garter belt, silent and dark. I had diverted all business calls to a dead server the moment I stepped off the altar. I'm afraid I can't do that, I said, leaning in close so only the family could hear. I don't work for you anymore. And as Caleb so eloquently put it, I'm busy receiving my wedding gifts. Arthur looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the predator I had become under his tutelage. He realized that the silence coming from my phone wasn't a technical glitch. It was a death knell for his legacy. But as he opened his mouth to plead, I saw Caleb's face turn from pale to a deep, ugly purple. He still didn't get it. He reached out to grab my arm, his ego refusing to accept the wreckage he'd caused. You're going to fix this, you ungrateful... Caleb started, but the sound of his own father's hand slamming against the table silenced him. The room went deathly quiet. In the distance, the sound of a heavy rain began to pelt the glass roof, sealing us all inside this glittering cage. Elena, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. Please, what do you want? I took a slow sip of my drink, let the bubbles tingle on my tongue, and looked at the clock. The markets in London would be opening soon, and the news of the contract loss was already leaking to the press. I want to dance, I said, and then I want to see how much of this company is left by sunrise. If you're enjoying this tale of cold-blooded corporate revenge and wedding day justice, don't miss the next twist. The empire is crumbling, and the bride hasn't even cut the cake yet. To keep following Elena's journey as she turns a termination letter into a hostile takeover, follow/subscribe for instant updates on new chapters. Drop a revenge in the comments if you think Caleb got exactly what he deserved. Share this story with anyone who's ever dreamed of firing their boss. The jazz band had stopped playing. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a vacuum. The elite of the city stood frozen, champagne flutes halfway to their lips, watching the royal family of logistics crumble in the middle of a ballroom. Arthur's face was no longer gray. It was translucent. He looked like a man watching his own house burn down from the inside, knowing he was the one who had locked the doors. He looked at Caleb, who was still vibrating with a mixture of confusion and misplaced rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Arthur whispered to his son. The whisper was more terrifying than the roar. That contract was the collateral for the expansion loan. Without Vanguard, the bank calls the debt. By Monday morning, this family owns nothing but the clothes on their backs. Caleb blinked, his mouth working like a fish out of water. "But she's Julian's wife. She can't just let us fail. Elena, tell him. Tell him you'll call Marcus." I adjusted my veil, the lace feeling like armor. "Julian's wife is currently unemployed, Caleb. And Julian's wife is wondering why her husband is standing 3 feet away from her instead of standing next to her." I turned my gaze to Julian. He looked broken, caught between the gravity of his father's shadow and the collapsing star of our marriage. He hadn't said a word to defend me when the letter was handed over. He hadn't said a word when his brother insulted me. He was a man built of soft edges and inherited safety, and in the harsh light of a $28 million disaster, he was fading into the wallpaper. "Elena, please." Julian finally found his voice, but it was thin. "My father is right. This affects everyone. Our future, the house we looked at in the Hamptons. It's all tied to the firm." "Our future was tied to respect, Julian," I said, my voice carrying a rhythmic, melodic coldness. "You watched your brother fire me on our wedding day as a prank and a restructuring move. You didn't choose me, you chose the firm. So, let the firm provide for you." I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand buffet, my train sweeping across the marble like a wave. I picked up a silver dessert fork and tapped it against a crystal glass. The sound rang out, sharp and clear, demanding the attention of every billionaire and socialite in the room. "Everyone," I announced, a bright, jagged smile on my face. "I'd like to make a change to the evening's program. Since my generous father-in-law and his son have decided to release me from my duties, I have plenty of free time. I've decided to move the honeymoon up. In fact, I'm leaving in 20 minutes. Elena, stop this." Arthur hurried toward me, his hands outstretched as if he could physically catch the disappearing threads of his company. "We'll double your salary, triple it, partner status, right now. Just pick up the phone and tell Marcus there was a misunderstanding with a junior staff member." He pointed a shaking finger at Caleb. Caleb's eyes went wide. The prince was being offered up as a sacrificial lamb. "A junior staff member?" I laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the glass ceiling. "Caleb isn't junior. He's the future of the company, remember? Your words, Arthur. At the last board meeting, you said the bloodline is the bottom line." I leaned in, my bouquet of lilies, and the hidden termination letter, resting against his expensive tuxedo. "The bloodline just bled you dry," I whispered. At that moment, the doors to the ballroom swung open. 2 men in dark suits, looking entirely too sober for a wedding, stepped inside. I recognized them immediately. They weren't guests. They were auditors from the Vanguard Group, led by Marcus's right-hand man. They didn't head for the bar. They headed straight for me. The room held its breath. Arthur looked like he was about to have a stroke. He stepped forward to intercept them, putting on his best "everything is under control" corporate mask. "Gentlemen, a bit late for the ceremony, but..." The lead auditor didn't even look at him. He walked right past the CEO and stopped in front of me, bowing his head slightly. "Mrs. Elena, or should I say, Director Elena?" the man asked. He handed me a tablet. "The transfer documents are ready for your digital signature. As per the contingency agreement, since your employment was terminated, the intellectual property and the client transition protocols have been moved to your private holding firm." The room gasped. Caleb's glass hit the floor, shattering into a million shimmering diamonds. I hadn't just waited for them to fire me. I had prepared for it the moment I saw Caleb's name added to the board 6 months ago. I knew nepotism was a disease, and I had built the cure. "Thank you, David," I said, sliding my finger across the screen to sign. I looked at Arthur, whose mouth was hanging open. "I didn't just take the contract, Arthur. I took the architecture. Vanguard isn't leaving the industry. They're just leaving you." The microhook was set. The shark was now the bait. "Wait," Julian whispered, stepping forward. "Elena, what does this mean for us?" I looked at my husband, the man who had stayed silent while his family tried to humiliate me. I reached into my bouquet, pulled out the termination letter, and handed it to him. "It means," I said, "that you should probably see if the firm has an opening for a junior associate. I hear they're going to be looking for a lot of new people very soon." I began to unpin my veil, letting the heavy lace fall to the floor in a heap of white discarded promises. "Elena!" Arthur screamed as I walked toward the exit. "You can't do this. We're family." I stopped at the threshold of the ballroom, the rain outside creating a silver curtain of freedom. "Business is business, Arthur," I said, throwing his own favorite phrase back at him. "And today, business is closed." But as I stepped into the night, I saw a black car waiting. Not the limo we had booked, a different car, and the person opening the door wasn't a driver. The person holding the door open was Marcus Thorne, the CEO of the Vanguard Group himself. He wasn't wearing wedding finery. He was in a sharp charcoal gray business suit, looking like the personification of a market crash. He didn't look at the chaos behind me. He only looked at me. "The jet is fueled, Elena?" Marcus said, his voice a low rumble that felt more stable than anything I had experienced in the last 3 hours. "The board of Vanguard has already approved the new venture. By the time we land in Singapore, your new firm will be the primary holder of the logistics corridor." I glanced back one last time. The Botanical Garden, once a place of romantic dreams, now looked like a shipwreck in a glass bottle. I could see Julian standing by the fountain, the termination letter limp in his hand. He looked small. I realized then that I hadn't lost a husband today. I had outgrown a souvenir. "Let's go," I said, stepping into the car. The scent of expensive leather and cedarwood replaced the suffocating smell of jasmine. As the car pulled away, I checked my phone. It was finally ringing. Not a work call, but a private notification. The first short sale orders had hit the market. Arthur's company stock was plummeting in the pre-market trading like a lead weight in a dark ocean. Caleb's wedding gift had just cost his family their entire net worth. "You knew they would do it, didn't you?" Marcus asked, watching the city lights blur past the window. "I knew Caleb," I replied, leaning back into the seat. "Men like him can't help but try to break things they didn't build. I just made sure that when he broke it, the pieces fell into my lap." We drove in silence for a while, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the wet pavement sounding like a heartbeat. I felt the weight of the heavy diamond ring on my finger. It felt like a shackle. Without a word, I twisted it off and dropped it into the crystal ashtray of the limousine. The clink was the most satisfying sound of the night. "What's the first move once we're airborne?" Marcus asked, opening a laptop. "We don't wait for Singapore," I said, my eyes fixed on the glowing red numbers on the screen. "Arthur will try to liquidize his personal assets to cover the margin calls by dawn. We're going to buy his warehouse permits before he even realizes he's selling them to me." The irony was delicious. By the time the sun rose over the city, I wouldn't just be the woman they fired. I would be their landlord. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a text message. It wasn't from Julian, and it wasn't from Arthur. It was an unknown number. You think you're the only one who had a contingency plan, Elena? Look at the second page of the envelope. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, sharp curiosity. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folded termination letter. I had been so focused on the first page, the bold letters of my firing, that I hadn't even looked at the back of the vellum. I unfolded it slowly. On the back, in a handwriting that was far too elegant to be Caleb's and far too steady to be Arthur's, was a single line of text and a QR code. The $28 million was just the distraction. Welcome to the real game. I looked at the QR code, then at Marcus. He was watching me, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. The rain lashed against the windows, sealing us in our private, moving sanctuary of ambition and secrets. I realized then that the $28 million contract wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening bid in a much more dangerous auction. Marcus, I said softly, my thumb hovering over the screen. What exactly did you and Julian's mother discuss at the charity gala last month? The car slowed as we approached the private airfield, the turbines of the jet already whining in the distance. The real wedding gift was about to be revealed, and I had a feeling it was going to be much more expensive than a lost contract. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He reached for a crystal decanter, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid as the car came to a smooth halt on the tarmac. The jet stood there, a silver needle ready to stitch a new map of power across the globe. Julian's mother, Beatrice, is a woman who understands that a dynasty is only as strong as its smartest player, Marcus said, handing me a glass. And she knew her husband and her sons weren't the ones holding the deck. I scanned the QR code. My screen flickered, bypassing 3 layers of biometric security before opening a hidden trust ledger. My breath caught. It wasn't just a document. It was a deed. Beatrice hadn't just watched her son Caleb humiliate me. She had used his predictable stupidity as a legal crowbar. The ledger revealed that Beatrice had quietly transferred her 40% stake in the family holding company into a blind trust, one that listed me as the sole beneficiary upon the dissolution of professional ties. By firing me, Caleb hadn't just triggered the Vanguard loss. He had effectively handed me the keys to the family vault. Beatrice hadn't been an accomplice to my humiliation. She had been the architect of my coronation. She was done watching her husband and son bleed the company dry with their egos. She had chosen a successor who actually knew how to win. She knew you'd leave them, Marcus whispered, his eyes reflecting the runway lights. She just wanted to make sure you took the walls with you when you walked out the door. I looked at the jet, then down at my bare ring finger. The skin was still indented where the diamond had sat, a ghost of a life I had already buried. Outside, the rain had turned into a mist, blurring the line between the earth and the sky. Arthur and Caleb are going to spend the rest of their lives wondering which one of them made the mistake, I said, a cold, sharp thrill running through my veins. They'll blame each other in the breadlines. And Julian? Marcus asked. I thought of Julian, standing in the garden with the rain ruining his tuxedo, a man who waited for permission to exist. Julian is a footnote, Marcus. I don't read the footnotes. As the cabin door hissed shut and the engines began their low-frequency roar, I pulled up the company's internal server one last time. I had one final gift to deliver. With a single tap, I sent a mass email to every employee, from the board members to the janitors. Subject, new management. Attachment, the 40% trust deed and the Vanguard partnership agreement. The message was simple. The throne isn't empty. It's just moved. As the jet lifted off, G-force pressing me back into the seat, I watched the city lights shrink into a grid of tiny, insignificant sparks. Somewhere down there, Arthur was probably screaming at a silent phone. Caleb was probably realizing that his prank had turned him into a pauper. and Julian was holding a piece of paper that represented the only real thing he'd ever lost. I took a sip of the scotch, the burn a perfect match for the fire in my chest. Singapore, Marcus asked, opening a fresh file on his screen. No, I said, looking out at the horizon where the sun was just beginning to bruise the sky with the first light of a new day. Tell the pilot to head for London. I want to be standing on the steps of the exchange when the bell rings. The boss's son thought he gave me a termination letter. But in the end, he gave me the world. And I was going to make sure it was a world where men like him were nothing more than a memory.